Story 1. The Uncharted Track. I found myself standing at the mouth of a tunnel that shouldn't exist, staring down at rails that curved into absolute darkness. My flashlight beam died 20 feet in, swallowed by something thicker than shadow. Behind me, the regular tunnels hummed with their familiar electric pulse. Ahead, there was only silence, the kind that feels like it's waiting for something. My hand was already on the radio, but I didn't call it in. Not yet, because according to every map, every blueprint, every maintenance log from the past 40 years, I was standing in solid bedrock. I've been inspecting tracks for the Metropolitan Transit Authority for 23 years. The work is methodical, predictable in ways that most people would find suffocating. I've always found comfort in that predictability. Tuesday through Saturday, 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. I walk the same sections of tunnel with my clipboard, my gauges, my practiced eye. I check rail alignment, bolt tension, ballast depth, drainage flow. I document everything. The underground doesn't surprise me anymore, or at least it hadn't until 3 weeks ago. My name is Howard Brennan, and I'm what they call a senior track inspector. That means I get the quieter sections, the ones where nothing ever happens. Section 7B between Ashford Station and the maintenance depot on Riverside is about as uneventful as it gets. The tunnel runs straight for 2 miles, a gentle grade, good ventilation. I've walked it 1,000 times. On October 12th, I was conducting my standard Wednesday inspection. The morning had been unremarkable. Checked the expansion joints near Ashford, noted some minor concrete spalling that maintenance would handle in the next cycle, verified the drainage pumps were functioning. Everything by the book. At marker 2.3, roughly halfway through the section, I stopped to check a rail joint that had shown some wear on my last inspection. I knelt down with my gauge, measuring the gap between rail ends. Within tolerance. I made my notation, stood up, and that's when I noticed it. About 15 feet ahead on the western wall of the tunnel, there was an opening I'd never seen before. I stood there for a full minute, my mind trying to process what I was looking at. It wasn't large, maybe 6 feet high, 5 feet wide, but it was definitely a passage. The edges were finished with the same tile work as the main tunnel, not some crude break in the concrete. This was intentional construction. I walked toward it slowly, my flashlight beam preceding me. The opening led to another tunnel, narrower than the main line, with a single track running down its center. The rails looked old, covered in a fine layer of rust and dust, but structurally intact. I pulled out my pocket map, the laminated one I've carried for over a decade, and traced my finger along section 7B. There was no junction here, no maintenance access, nothing. I radioed dispatch. Brennan to Central, I'm at marker 2.3 in section 7B. I've got an unmarked tunnel junction here. Can you pull up the master plans and confirm? The radio crackled. Copy that, Brennan, stand by. I waited, studying the tunnel mouth. The air coming from it felt different, cooler, drier, with a faint metallic smell that reminded me of old coins. I could see about 30 feet in before my flashlight beam diffused into the darkness. Brennan, Central. We're showing no junctions in 7B between Ashford and Riverside. Can you describe what you're seeing? I described it in detail. There was a long pause. Brennan, we're going to send someone from engineering to meet you. Don't proceed into that space until they arrive. Estimated 20 minutes. But I was already walking in. I told myself I was just doing a preliminary assessment. That's what a senior inspector does, evaluates situations, makes judgment calls. But the truth was something else. In 23 years of walking these tunnels, I'd never found something that wasn't supposed to be there. The underground was mapped, documented, cataloged. There were no mysteries left, and yet here was one. Opening up before me like a question I couldn't ignore. The narrow tunnel ran straight for about 100 yards, then curved gently to the north. The single track was standard gauge, identical to our main lines, but the rails themselves were an older design, heavier with a slightly different profile. I recognized them from a training manual I'd read years ago. They were probably from the 1940s or early 1950s. At the curve, I found the first car. It was a maintenance flat car, the kind we use to transport equipment and materials through the tunnels. But this one had been sitting here for decades. The orange paint had faded to a dull rust color, and the wooden deck had rotted through in places. What caught my attention was what remained on the flat car. A series of wooden crates, all empty, lids removed and leaning against them. I examined the crates. They were old, definitely military surplus based on the stenciling I could still make out, but whatever they'd contained was long gone. I photographed them with my phone, noting that I had no signal this far in. The tunnel continued beyond the flat car, curving more sharply now. I should have turned back. I knew that. But I kept walking. After another 50 yards, I found the second car. This one was a passenger car, or what was left of one. The windows were intact but covered in decades of grime. The door hung open on one hinge. I climbed inside. The interior was stripped bare, seats removed, fixtures gone. Even the overhead panels had been taken out. It was just a shell. But on the floor in the dust I could see footprints, recent footprints. Someone had been here within the last few days. My radio crackled with static. Bray. Your pause. The signal was breaking up. I tried to respond but got only more static. I checked my phone. No signal, and the battery was draining rapidly, down to 30% even though it had been fully charged an hour ago. I should have turned back then. I know that now, but I didn't. The tunnel beyond the passenger car began to descend, not steeply but noticeably. The temperature dropped, and the air became heavy with moisture. The track curved again, and suddenly I was standing at the entrance to a station. It was impossible. I was still in Section 7B, which ran between two mapped stations with nothing in between. But here was a platform tiled in white and green with vintage light fixtures and wooden benches. A sign on the wall read Meridian Station in the old Metropolitan Transit Authority style. Serif font, brass letters. I'd never heard of Meridian Station. The platform was pristine. Not abandoned, pristine. The tiles were clean, the benches polished. A trash can near the exit tunnel held fresh garbage, coffee cups, newspapers. I picked up one of the newspapers. The date was October 11th, yesterday. But the paper itself was wrong. The layout was from the 1960s, the advertisements for products that didn't exist anymore. The headlines described events I didn't recognize. I walked the length of the platform. There were 2 exit tunnels, one at each end, both with staircases leading up. Both were blocked by locked gates. I tried my master key, the one that opens every MTA gate in the system, but it didn't fit the locks. That's when I heard the train. The sound came from deeper in the tunnel beyond the platform. Not the electric hum of our modern trains, but the older, heavier rumble of diesel engines. I could feel it through the platform, a vibration that built slowly until the rails began to sing with it. I stepped back from the platform edge, my heart accelerating. The sound grew louder, closer. I could see a light now, yellow and flickering, not the bright white of our trains. The vibration in the platform became a tremor, and then it emerged from the tunnel. It was a maintenance train from the 1950s, 3 diesel engines pulling a string of flat cars loaded with equipment. But as it passed through the station without slowing, I realized I couldn't see anyone in the cab of the lead engine. The windows were dark, empty. The train moved with mechanical precision, following the rails into the opposite tunnel, the sound gradually fading until there was only silence again. I stood on that platform for what felt like an hour, but was probably only minutes. My mind was trying to construct explanations, a preserved section of the old system, a training facility, a museum installation. But none of it fit. The newspaper was from yesterday, the garbage was fresh, and that train had no driver. When I finally turned to leave, retracing my steps back through the tunnel, I found that the passenger car was gone. The space where it had been sitting was empty, just bare track. The flat car was still there, but the crates had been moved, restacked in a different configuration. I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I ran back through that tunnel until I burst out into Section 7B, gasping, my flashlight beam wild against the walls. When I looked back, the opening was still there, but it was smaller now. Or perhaps it had always been that size, and I'd just remembered it wrong. My radio crackled to life. "Brennan, what's your status? Engineering is en route to your position." I stared at the opening, breathing hard. "I'm here. At marker 2.3, I'm okay." When the engineering team arrived 30 minutes later with their ground-penetrating radar and structural sensors, they found nothing. The tunnel wall at marker 2.3 was solid concrete, 3 feet thick with bedrock beyond. Their instruments showed no void, no opening, no anomaly of any kind. But I could still see it. The opening was right there, shadowed and waiting. They suggested I take the rest of the day off. Possible carbon monoxide exposure, they said, though their meters showed normal air quality. I accepted gratefully and made my way back to the depot. That was 3 weeks ago. I've been back to Section 7B 12 times since then, always at marker 2.3, always during my regular shift. The opening is still there. Sometimes it's larger, sometimes smaller. Twice I've seen that train pass through Meridian Station, always without a crew. Once I found a new newspaper on the platform dated October 19th. Still in that impossible 1960s style, still describing a world I don't recognize. I haven't told anyone else. I haven't gone back in, though I think about it constantly. The reports sit in my locker, unphotographed, unsubmitted, because I know how this works. I know what happens to inspectors who report things that aren't there, but sometimes during the quiet part of my shift, I stand at marker 2.3 and I listen. Deep in that tunnel beyond Meridian Station, I can hear rails humming with purpose. There are other stations down there, I think. Other trains running schedules that were written decades ago and never canceled. A whole system operating beneath our system, following rules we've forgotten. And sometimes I wonder if I'm supposed to find them. If that's why the tunnel opened for me and no one else. If there's a track down there with my name on it, waiting for me to walk its length and discover where it leads. The underground keeps its secrets well, and I've learned that some maps are incomplete for a reason. Some tunnels don't want to be found. They want to find you. Copy deep research right till the last one. Dawn stop. Story 2. The Echoing Footsteps. The footsteps stopped directly behind me. I could feel them there, close enough that I should have been able to hear breathing, feel body heat in the cold tunnel air. My flashlight was trained on the wall ahead, my shadow sharp against the concrete. But when I turned around, sweeping the beam across the tunnel, there was nothing. Just empty tracks stretching back toward the last junction, and silence so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. Then from somewhere deeper in the darkness, I heard them again. Slow, deliberate steps. Coming closer. My name is Dennis Kellerman, and I've been a track inspector for the Metropolitan Transit Authority for 16 years. Not as long as some of the veterans, but long enough to know every sound the tunnels make, every echo, every vibration. The underground has its own language if you learn to listen. The tick of cooling rails, the drip of condensation, the distant thunder of trains in adjacent sections. After 16 years, I can identify a sound source without even thinking about it. That's why the footsteps bothered me so much, because they were a sound I couldn't place, couldn't rationalize, couldn't ignore. It started on November 3rd during a routine night inspection of Section 12C. Night inspections aren't my usual assignment. I typically work the early morning shift. But we were short-staffed and I'd volunteered for the overtime. Section 12C runs between Colton Station and the abandoned Westfield platform, a stretch of tunnel that sees minimal traffic. One train every 40 minutes during the day, nothing after 11 p.m. I entered the tunnel at 11:47 p.m., clipboard in hand, following my standard inspection routine. The air was cool and damp, typical for November. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness ahead, picking out rails, tie plates, the occasional service alcove. Everything was exactly as it should be. I was about a quarter mile in, checking a section of drainage pipe when I first heard them. Footsteps behind me, walking at the same pace I had been walking before I stopped. I straightened up, turned around. "Hello?" My voice echoed back to me, but there was no other response. The tunnel behind me was empty. I could see all the way back to the entrance, maybe 300 yards of straight track. Nobody there. I shook my head, returned to my inspection. Probably just an echo of my own steps, delayed somehow by the tunnel acoustics. It happens sometimes in certain configurations of concrete and curved walls. But when I started walking again, I heard them again. Distinct footsteps matching my rhythm but slightly behind me, like someone was following at a distance of maybe 20 or 30 feet. I stopped. The footsteps continued for 2 more beats, then stopped. "This is a restricted area," I called out. "If someone's there, identify yourself." Nothing. I pulled out my radio. "Kellerman to Central, I'm in Section 12C, approximately quarter mile from Colton entrance. Can you confirm I'm the only inspector in this section tonight?" The response came back immediately. "Confirmed, Kellerman. You're solo in 12C. Next nearest personnel is Martinez in Section 14A. Everything okay?" "Yeah, just checking. Thought I heard something. Copy that. Let us know if you need backup." I continued my inspection, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every time I stopped to examine something, I'd hear those footsteps approach and then halt. Always at the same distance, never getting closer or farther away. Always just out of sight. At the halfway point, there's a service alcove with a junction box I needed to inspect. The alcove is recessed about 8 feet into the tunnel wall. Just deep enough that you have to step fully into it to access the equipment. I hesitated before entering, that primal part of my brain screaming that I was putting myself in a confined space with something at my back. But I'm a professional. I've worked alone in these tunnels hundreds of times. I stepped into the alcove and opened the junction box. Behind me, the footsteps entered the main tunnel, moving from the rail bed onto the concrete service path. They were clearer now, more distinct. Heavy boots like the steel-toed ones we all wear, walking with purpose. I spun around, flashlight up, empty tunnel, nothing. But I could still hear them. They hadn't stopped this time. They were continuing past the alcove, heading deeper into the tunnel, moving away from me now. I stepped out of the alcove and swept my light down the tunnel. I caught a glimpse of something just for a moment, at the extreme edge of my beam's reach. A shadow that seemed darker than the surrounding darkness, moving along the left wall. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice breaking slightly. "Stop!" The footsteps didn't stop. They continued at that same measured pace, receding into the distance. I started after them, walking quickly, my light bouncing with each step. The shadow stayed just ahead of me, always at the edge of visibility. Then the footsteps stopped. Just ceased, mid-stride, as if whoever was making them had suddenly been lifted off the ground. I stopped too, breathing hard, listening. The silence was absolute. Even the usual ambient sounds of the tunnel seemed muted, dampened. I realized I couldn't hear the ventilation fans, couldn't feel any air movement. It was like being in a sealed room. My radio crackled. I grabbed it. Central, this is static, pure static, no voices underneath, no carrier tone, just white noise. I tried again, same result. My phone showed no signal, which wasn't unusual this deep in the tunnels, but the battery was draining rapidly. It had been at 70% when I entered. Now it showed 32%. I made a decision. I'd continue forward to the next inspection point, then head back. No point in abandoning the inspection over some acoustic anomaly and radio interference. That's what I told myself. The truth was, I didn't want to turn my back on that empty tunnel and walk toward where those footsteps had been following me. The next inspection point was a ventilation grate about 200 yards ahead. As I approached, I noticed something on the ground just past the grate. I crouched down to look. Footprints. In the thin layer of dust and grime that accumulates on the concrete service path. They were boot prints, fresh ones, the tread pattern still clearly visible. They led from the rail bed across the service path and directly to the ventilation grate. Then they stopped. Just ended as if whoever had made them had simply vanished at that spot. I examined them more closely. The tread pattern was familiar. Wolverine brand work boots. The same kind I wore, the same kind most inspectors wore. But there was something wrong with the prints themselves. They were too deep, pressed into the concrete with more force than normal walking would create. And they were spaced oddly, the stride length inconsistent, as if the person had been limping or walking with some kind of irregular gait. I looked up at the ventilation grate. It was sealed with a heavy metal grating bolted in place. Nobody could have gone through it. And yet the prints led directly to it and nowhere else. I stood up, my knees cracking, and that's when I noticed the silence had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. There was a sound, very faint, coming from somewhere ahead in the tunnel. A low, rhythmic scraping like metal dragging across concrete. I walked toward it, my flashlight beam steady now, my breathing controlled. I'm not sure why I didn't turn back. Maybe because I'd spent 16 years walking these tunnels and I'd be damned if I was going to be scared off by sounds and shadows. Maybe because I needed to know what was making those noises, needed to prove to myself that there was a rational explanation. The scraping sound grew louder as I approached the old Westfield platform. The platform had been closed for 20 years, sealed off when the station above was demolished for a new development project. But the platform itself still existed down here, a ghost station in the dark. As I got closer, I realized the sound was coming from the platform level. Something was moving up there, dragging across the tiles. I climbed the access stairs slowly, my light preceding me. The platform came into view in sections. First the edge, then the yellowed tiles, then the far wall with its faded advertisements for products nobody made anymore. The scraping stopped. I stood on the platform, turning slowly in a circle, my light playing across every surface. The space was empty, exactly as it should be. Dusty tiles, peeling paint, the sealed exit gates at either end. Nothing out of place, except for the footprints. They were everywhere. The same boot prints I'd found near the ventilation grate, crisscrossing the platform in a chaotic pattern. They covered the tiles, overlapping, intersecting as if someone had been pacing back and forth for hours. Some of them led to the sealed gates, some to the platform edge, some to the walls. None of them led away. I followed one set with my flashlight beam. They walked from the center of the platform to the far wall, then simply ended. The last print was smeared slightly, as if the person had pivoted on one foot, but there were no prints leading away, They just stopped existing. My radio came back to life with a burst of static. "Lerman, respond. Kellerman, what's your status?" I grabbed it. "I'm here, Central. I'm at the Westfield platform." "Kellerman, we've been trying to reach you for 20 minutes. Are you all right?" 20 minutes? I'd only been out of contact for a few minutes at most. "I'm fine. Radio interference. Listen, I need you to check something. Can you pull up the maintenance logs for Section 12C? Specifically the Westfield platform area. I want to know when the last inspection was done here." There was a pause. I could hear keyboard clicking. "Last documented inspection of the Westfield platform was 2 weeks ago. Inspector Collins did a structural assessment. Before that, 6 months prior, routine check by Inspector Wade. Did either of them report anything unusual?" Another pause. Collins noted some evidence of water intrusion, recommended repairs. Wade's report was standard, no anomalies. "Why, what are you seeing?" I was about to describe the footprints when I looked down and realized they were fading. Not slowly, rapidly. As I watched, the clear boot impressions became blurred, then indistinct, then simply vanished as if they'd never existed. Within 30 seconds, the platform tiles showed nothing but the usual layer of undisturbed dust. "Kellerman?" "Nothing," I said. "Just checking. I'm going to complete the inspection and head back." "Copy that. Let us know when you're clear of the section." I left the platform quickly, descending the stairs back to the tunnel level. I needed to get out of there, needed to be somewhere with lights and people and rational explanations. I started back toward the Colton entrance, walking faster than I should have, my breath coming in short gasps. The footsteps started again behind me, but this time they weren't matching my pace. They were faster, more urgent, and they were getting closer. I broke into a run. The footsteps behind me accelerated into a run as well. I could hear them clearly now, boots pounding on concrete, closing the distance, 20 feet behind. 15. 10. I didn't look back. I just ran, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly, my equipment bag slapping against my hip. The Colton entrance was ahead. I could see the glow of the platform lights reflecting off the tunnel walls. 5 feet behind me. I could hear breathing now, ragged and wet, like someone running with damaged lungs. I burst out of the tunnel onto the Colton platform and collapsed against the wall, gasping. The platform was empty. It was past midnight, no passengers, no other staff. But it was lit. It was open. It was real. I turned around slowly, shining my light back into the tunnel mouth. Nothing. Empty track disappearing into darkness. No footsteps, no breathing, no shadow. But as I stood there catching my breath, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. On the platform, just inches from where I'd emerged from the tunnel, was a single footprint, the same boot pattern pressed into a thin patch of grime near the platform edge. It was pointed toward the tunnel, as if whoever had made it had been standing there watching the darkness, waiting for something to emerge. I reported sick the next day, took a personal day the day after that. When I returned to work, I requested a schedule change. No more night inspections, no more solo work in Section 12C. They accommodated me without question. There's always someone willing to take night shifts for the overtime. But I still hear about Section 12C. Inspector Morris worked it last week. He reported hearing sounds he couldn't explain, finished his inspection an hour early. Inspector Wade, the same Wade who'd done that routine check 6 months ago, requested a transfer to another section. He wouldn't say why. And 2 days ago, Central received a strange call from the automated tunnel monitoring system. The sensors in Section 12C detected movement on the Westfield platform at 2:17 a.m. Significant movement consistent with a person pacing back and forth. When they sent a team to investigate, they found nothing. But I know what they would have found if they'd gotten there sooner. Boot prints, dozens of them, pacing, searching, waiting. I don't know what walks in Section 12C, I don't know if it's something that's always been there or something that started recently. I don't know if it's dangerous or just present. What I do know is this: the tunnels remember. Every inspector who ever walked them, every maintenance worker who died down there, every accident that got buried in old reports, the tunnels remember all of it. And sometimes in the quiet hours between the last train and the first, that memory takes a shape and walks. I still work the tunnels, I still do my inspections, but I never work alone anymore, and I never ever respond to footsteps I can't see. Because in the underground, not everything that walks is still alive, and not everything that follows you wants to be found. Story 3. The missing signal. The error code made no sense. Sig Tetra 0 null flashing on my diagnostic screen in angry red letters. I'd been troubleshooting railway signals for 11 years, and I'd never seen that code. It wasn't in any manual, any database, any maintenance guide. When I called Central to report it, the dispatcher went silent for a long moment before saying, "That's not possible. That code was retired in 1987. The system can't generate it anymore." But it was right there on my screen, flashing, insistent, demanding acknowledgement. And when I finally entered the command to clear it, the signal box began showing me something else. Messages from trains that hadn't run in decades, warnings about accidents that hadn't happened yet. And, buried in the cascade of impossible data, my own name, repeated over and over, tagged with a date from 40 years ago. My name is Gregory Thorne. I'm a signal maintenance technician for the Metropolitan Transit Authority assigned to the Western District. My job is to keep the railway signaling system operational, the complex network of lights, switches, sensors, and computers that keep trains from colliding, that route them efficiently through the maze of tracks and tunnels that underlies the city. It's technical work, detail-oriented, the kind of job where precision matters and small mistakes can have catastrophic consequences. I've always been good at it. 11 years without a significant error, hundreds of successful troubleshooting sessions, a reputation as the guy who can fix anything signal-related. When the system acts up, I'm usually the one they call. On November 18th at 3:22 a.m., I got a call that would end my certainty about what was real and what was possible. "Thorne, we've got a dark signal at Junction 47. No response to remote resets, diagnostics showing anomalous readings. Can you get out there?" Junction 47 is a critical node in the Western District network, a point where 4 different lines converge. A dark signal there could create cascade delays across half the system. I grabbed my equipment bag and headed out immediately. The signal box for Junction 47 is located in a maintenance room adjacent to Harmon Station, accessed through a service corridor that branches off the main platform. At 3:45 a.m., the station was closed, empty except for the overnight security guard who let me through without comment. He looked tired, bored, eager to get back to his coffee and his phone. The service corridor was familiar territory. Concrete walls painted industrial green, fluorescent lights humming overhead, that particular smell of damp and machine oil that permeates all underground spaces. The signal box room was at the end, a reinforced door with a keycard lock. I swiped my card. The light blinked red. Denied. I tried again. Same result. This was odd. My card had master access to all Western District signal boxes. I pulled out my radio. "Central, Thorne, I'm at Junction 47 signal box, but my access card isn't working. Can you verify my clearance?" "Stand by." I waited in the corridor, listening to the distant sounds of the tunnels, the perpetual hum of ventilation, the occasional rumble of a train passing through an adjacent section. The fluorescent light above me flickered intermittently, creating a strobe effect that made the corridor seem to pulse. "Thorne, we're showing your clearance as active. Try again." I swiped the card a third time. This time, after a longer delay than usual, the light blinked green and the lock clicked open. The signal box room was small, maybe 12 by 15 feet, dominated by the main control panel that took up most of one wall. Banks of monitors, switches, diagnostic displays, and the central computer terminal that managed the automated systems. Everything was illuminated by the soft glow of the screens and the red standby lights of the equipment. The main diagnostic monitor was showing the error I'd been called about. The signal for track 3 at junction 47 was indeed dark, but the error code displayed beneath it was wrong. Sig Tetra 0 null. I stared at it for a long moment. In 11 years, I'd encountered hundreds of error codes. Sig 2847 for sensor malfunctions, Sig 452 for power failures, Sig 6633 for communication errors. Each code was specific, diagnostic, a breadcrumb leading toward the solution. But Sig Tetra 0 null was meaningless. The format was wrong. Signal error codes never used zeros in the first position, and null wasn't a designation the system used. I sat down at the terminal and pulled up the error code database. I typed in Sig Tetra 0 null. No results found. I tried variations. Sig Tetra 0, Sig null, Tetra 0 null. Nothing. The code simply didn't exist in the system's vocabulary. I called Central again. I'm looking at this error code and I can't find it in any database. Sig Tetra 0 null. Does that mean anything to you? There was a pause. I could hear keyboard clicking in the background. Thorn, that's not a current code. That was a placeholder code used in the old analog system before the digital conversion in 1987. It shouldn't be possible for the current system to generate it. Well, it just did. It's right here on my screen. Can you clear it and run a standard diagnostic? I entered the command sequence to clear the error. The screen blinked, refreshed. And then things got strange. Instead of returning to the normal operational display, the screen filled with text. Lines and lines of data scrolling rapidly upward, too fast to read. But I caught fragments as they passed. Train 847, junction 47 delay, 14-minute signal malfunction, train 623 derailment, track 7. Maintenance failure, train 902 Colton Station, overcrowding, medical emergency. These were incident reports, I realized, but they were formatted wrong, using old codes and abbreviations I hadn't seen since my training days, when we'd studied the history of the signal system. These reports were from decades ago. The scrolling stopped suddenly, freezing on a single entry. Train 485, junction 47, track 3, signal failure, collision, imminent, operator, Thorn G. I felt ice in my stomach, my name, but train 485, I'd never heard of a train 485, and the date stamp on the entry was March 12, 1983. I was born in 1988. I tried to clear the screen, but the keyboard wasn't responding. I reached for the power switch to force a restart, but before I could flip it, the display changed again. New text appeared, one line at a time, as if someone was typing it in real time. Gregory Thorne, Signal Maintenance, Western District, you are correcting an error. The error began 42 years ago. The error will end tonight. I stared at the screen, my hand frozen on the power switch. The room felt colder suddenly, the air heavy with a metallic taste. Who is this? I said aloud, feeling ridiculous even as I did it. But the text continued. Check maintenance logs, junction 47, March 1983. I pulled out my phone and accessed the MTA's historical database. It took several minutes of searching. The older records weren't digitized as thoroughly as recent data, but I finally found the maintenance logs for junction 47 from March 1983. March 12, 1983, signal failure, track 3, cause. Technician error during routine maintenance. Near-miss incident, no casualties. Technician name, redacted. I scrolled through the report. It was sparse on details, but the narrative was clear enough. A signal maintenance technician had been working on the Junction 47 signal box when something went wrong. He'd entered an incorrect command sequence, causing the signal to fail at a critical moment. 2 trains had been routed toward the same track. Only the quick action of a dispatcher who'd noticed the error on his board prevented a collision. The trains had been stopped with less than 100 yards between them. The technician had been fired. His name had been redacted from all official records, as was standard practice for terminated employees whose errors nearly caused catastrophic accidents. But someone remembered. The system remembered. The display changed again. The technician was your grandfather, Robert Thorne Sater, retired 1983. Died 1991. I sat back heavily in the chair. My grandfather. I'd never known him. He died when I was 3 years old, but I'd heard stories. He'd worked for the MTA for 30 years, my father had told me. Signals Division. He'd retired early before his pension would have maxed out. My father had never known why, had assumed it was health-related. But it wasn't health. It was shame. He'd nearly killed dozens of people through his own mistake, and he couldn't face coming back to work after that. The display continued. You carry his knowledge, you carry his skills, you must complete what he could not. What does that mean? I asked the screen. What couldn't he complete? The response came immediately. Signal Box 47 maintenance protocol incomplete. Junction 47 Track 3 contains fatal error in base programming. Error must be corrected manually, no remote access possible. You are the only technician with clearance and bloodline. I read this 3 times, trying to make sense of it. A fatal error in the base programming? The Junction 47 systems had been upgraded multiple times since 1983. Any error from that era would have been overwritten, corrected, erased, unless it hadn't been. Unless my grandfather, in his rush to cover up his mistake, had buried something deep in the system's code, something that had survived every upgrade, every migration to new hardware, every diagnostic scan. Something waiting. Show me the error, I typed. The screen changed to a view of the system's base code, layers of programming that I rarely accessed. Most modern maintenance work was done through user interfaces, graphical displays, automated diagnostics. You didn't need to dig into the actual code unless something was fundamentally broken. And there, buried deep in the subroutines that controlled Track 3's signaling logic, was an anomaly. A command sequence that didn't belong, that didn't match any standard protocol. It was sophisticated enough that automated scans would skip over it, would see it as part of the normal code structure. But it was wrong. I could see what it was designed to do. Under specific conditions, conditions that would only occur during a particular confluence of train schedules and track maintenance, it would override the safety protocols for Track 3. It would create a window just 90 seconds long during which the signal would show green to 2 trains simultaneously. It would cause exactly the kind of near-miss incident that my grandfather had narrowly averted 42 years ago. Except this time there might not be a watchful dispatcher to catch it. This time, it might not be a near miss. I checked the current schedule. My hands were shaking as I pulled up the data. Those specific conditions, the exact confluence that would trigger the buried code, were going to occur in 45 minutes. At 4:47 a.m., Train 622 and Train 834 would both be approaching Junction 47 on Track 3, one from each direction. Unless I fixed this right now, those trains were going to collide. I began working, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I needed to isolate the malicious code, extract it without corrupting the surrounding systems, then repair the resulting gaps in the programming. It was delicate work, the kind of thing that should take hours of careful analysis. I had 45 minutes. The display started showing me something else while I worked. Historical data, streaming past in a sidebar window. I could only glance at it intermittently, but what I saw made my blood run cold. This wasn't the first time. The conditions had aligned before 3 times in the past 42 years. In 1991, Train 477 and Train 530 had been approaching Junction 47 when a dispatcher noticed an anomaly and stopped both trains. In 2003, the same thing. In 2016, same situation, same last-second catch. But each time it was getting closer. The dispatchers were noticing later, stopping the trains with less margin for error. In 2016, the trains had been stopped with only 50 yards between them. This time, no one was watching Junction 47. The overnight dispatchers were focused on other sections, other problems. If I didn't fix this, no one would notice until it was too late. I worked with a focus I'd never experienced before. Everything else fell away. The room, the time, my own fear. There was only the code, the problem, the solution I was building line by line. At 4:39 a.m., I found something that stopped me cold. Buried even deeper in the code, beneath the malicious sequence was a message, a string of text that served no functional purpose, that was completely invisible to the system's operation. A ghost in the machine. It read, "For Gregory, I'm sorry I won't be there to teach you, but you'll figure it out. You're smarter than I was. Fix what I broke. Make it right. Grandpa Robert." He'd known. Somehow my grandfather had known that his mistake would eventually reach me, that I would follow him into this career, that I would end up here in this room at this terminal 42 years later. And he'd left me a message. Tears blurred my vision. I wiped them away and kept working. At 4:44 a.m., I isolated the final piece of malicious code. At 4:45 a.m., I extracted it, watching as the error propagated through the system, triggering warning messages and diagnostic alerts. At 4:46 a.m., I completed the repair, restoring the code to its proper state, implementing additional safeguards that should have been there from the beginning. At 4:47 a.m., Train 622 and Train 834 passed through Junction 47 on Track 3, 1 minute apart, exactly as scheduled. The signals functioned perfectly. The safety protocols held. No collision, no incident, no near miss that would end up in tomorrow's reports. I sat in the silence of the signal box, trembling, exhausted. The display had returned to normal operations. The error code, SIG Tetra 0 null, was gone. Everything showed green, functional, safe. My radio crackled. "Thorne, what's your status? We're showing Junction 47 back online." "Status is complete," I managed, and signal restored. "Everything's operational." "Good work. Head back when you're ready." I didn't move for a long time. I just sat there, staring at the screens, thinking about my grandfather. About how he'd carried the weight of his mistake for 8 years until it killed him. About how he'd hidden his error so thoroughly that it had taken 4 decades and a descendant with his same skills to finally undo it. Before I left, I accessed the historical database one more time and looked up my grandfather's full record. There, in the archived files, I found a photo from his employee ID. He was young in the picture, maybe 30, with dark hair and serious eyes. He looked exactly like me. I closed the signal box, swiped my card at the door, and walked back through the service corridor. The security guard nodded to me as I passed through the station. I stepped out into the pre-dawn darkness, breathing the cold November air, feeling the city waking up around me. I still work signals, I'm still good at my job. But now I understand something I didn't before. The systems we maintain, the networks we trust to keep people safe. They're not just machines. They're built by people, flawed people who make mistakes and hide them and hope they'll never come to light. And sometimes those mistakes survive long after the people who made them are gone. They wait in the code, in the dark spaces between commands, patient and persistent. waiting for someone to find them, to correct them, to make right what was broken long ago. I think about all the other signal boxes, all the other technicians who've worked these systems over the decades. I wonder what else is hidden in the code, what other errors are waiting for their moment to emerge. What other messages are buried in the machine left by people long dead, hoping someone will understand. The tunnels keep their secrets, but so do the systems we build to tame them. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, those systems remember everything. Story 4. The Midnight Crossing. The crossing gates came down at exactly midnight, just like they had every night for the past month. But there was no train scheduled. I checked the board 3 times, nothing due for another 40 minutes. The signals cycled through their sequence anyway. Yellow, red, the bells ringing their warning into the empty night. And then, impossibly, I heard it. The rumble of an approaching train from the abandoned northern tunnel, the one that had been sealed for 15 years. The tunnel that, according to every official record, led nowhere. The headlight appeared in the darkness, growing brighter, and I realized with creeping horror that I could see through the locomotive, see the tunnel wall behind it like looking through frosted glass. The phantom train was coming, and it wanted me to board. My name is Patricia Lansford, and for the past 8 years I've been a signal operator for the Metropolitan Transit Authority's Eastern District. My job is straightforward. I work the overnight shift in Control Station 7, monitoring rail crossings, verifying signal functions, ensuring that the automated systems are working correctly. It's solitary work, just me, the monitors, and the quiet hum of the equipment from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. I've always preferred working alone. No office politics, no small talk, no distractions. Just the clean logic of trains running on schedule. Signals changing at prescribed intervals, systems operating within defined parameters. There's a meditative quality to it, watching the tracking board, the little icons representing trains moving through their designated routes like blood cells through arteries. But a month ago, something changed at Crossing 23. Crossing 23 is a surface-level intersection where the eastbound line crosses Fairmont Avenue. It's a minor crossing, low traffic at night, equipped with standard safety systems, flashing lights, warning bells, mechanical gates. The crossing is controlled by a sensor system. When a train approaches within a quarter mile, the signals activate automatically. Simple, reliable, exactly the kind of mundane automation that makes my job possible. On October 23rd, at exactly midnight, the crossing gates at Fairmont Avenue went down. I noticed it on my monitor, the status indicator switching from green to red, signaling active crossing protocols. I glanced at the train tracking board. No train was scheduled to pass through Crossing 23 for another 50 minutes. I pulled up the sensor logs. They showed a train detection at the quarter-mile marker approaching from the north, but there was no corresponding icon on the tracking board, no scheduled train, no active equipment in that section. I ran a diagnostic. The sensors checked out as functional, no errors, no malfunctions. According to the system, a train was approaching Crossing 23 and the safety protocols were responding exactly as designed. But there was no train. After 2 minutes, the gates rose again. The status indicator returned to green. The sensor log showed a train had passed through the crossing heading south, continuing on the eastbound line toward Harmon Station. A ghost in the machine, I thought. A sensor glitch, something that registered as a train but wasn't. It happened occasionally, a truck passing too close to the tracks. A large piece of debris triggering the magnetic sensors, solar interference with the wireless signals. I made a note in the incident log and scheduled a maintenance inspection for the next day. The next night at exactly midnight, it happened again. Gates down, sensors showing approach. No train on the tracking board. 2 minutes later, gates up, sensors showing departure. I called the maintenance supervisor the next morning. "We've got a recurring false positive at crossing 23, 2 nights in a row, midnight exactly. Sensors are showing train detection, but there's nothing there." "Could be a timing glitch," he said. "Sometimes the system clock gets misaligned and logs repeat. We'll send someone to check the sensor calibration and the crossing controller." The maintenance team spent 4 hours at crossing 23 that afternoon. They recalibrated the sensors, tested the crossing controller, checked the power supply, verified the wireless communication links. Everything tested normal. No malfunctions detected. That night at midnight, the gates went down again. This time I was watching the monitor closely, finger poised over the manual override. The gates descended smoothly, the warning lights began flashing, the bells started their steady clanging. I pulled up the sensor data stream, watching the raw feed. Train detected, north approach, 0.25 miles train speed, 45 mph. Estimated arrival, 20 seconds. The numbers counted down, 20 seconds, 15:10. My hand hovered over the manual override button. If this was a false reading, if the gates stayed down too long, morning commuters would start dismantling the system manually, creating actual safety hazards. 5 seconds. 4. 3. On the monitor showing the live camera feed from crossing 23, I saw something move through the frame. It lasted less than 2 seconds. A blur of motion, something passing through the crossing at high speed. But the image was wrong, distorted like watching something through water. I could see the street beyond it, the buildings, the streetlights. The thing moving through the crossing was translucent, half real. Then it was gone. The gates rose. The status returned to green. I sat back in my chair, my heart hammering. I rewound the camera feed, played it again in slow motion. There, right at the 2-minute mark. The blur resolved into something more defined at slow speed, though still wrong, still impossible. It looked like a train. I could make out the rough shape of a locomotive and several cars, but rendered in shades of gray, transparent, like an old photograph superimposed on the real world. I called my supervisor. It was 12:15 a.m., and I was waking him up, but I didn't care. I just watched a ghost train pass through crossing 23. There was a long pause. "Lansford, have you been drinking?" "I'm dead serious. I have video. The sensors detected something. The crossing activated normally and something passed through, but it wasn't solid. It was... I don't know what it was." "Send me the video." I did. I waited, watching the monitors while he reviewed it. 5 minutes later, my phone rang. "That's atmospheric distortion," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. "Maybe fog, maybe some kind of optical effect from the streetlights." "It's not a train, Lansford. There's no train on that section of track at midnight. There hasn't been for years." "What about the sensors? They're detecting something. Malfunction. Has to be. I'll have the entire system replaced tomorrow." They replaced every sensor at crossing 23. New magnetic detectors, new wireless transmitters, new crossing controller, new programming. The most up-to-date equipment available, installed and tested by 2 separate engineering teams. That night at midnight, the gates went down. And this time, I wasn't the only one who saw something. A driver had stopped at the crossing, annoyed by the delay, filming the empty tracks with his phone. He posted the video to social media with the caption, "MTA Ghost Train BS making me late." The video went viral. In it, you could clearly see something passing through the crossing, translucent, gray, moving at speed. The quality was poor, shot through a dirty windshield, but it was unmistakable. Something was there. The MTA's public relations department went into damage control mode. Official statement. Optical illusion caused by specific lighting conditions. Crossing signals functioning normally, responding to nearby train on adjacent track. But there was no adjacent track. The eastbound line was isolated in that area, no other rails within a half-mile. I started doing research. If something impossible was happening, maybe it had roots in the past. I accessed the MTA's historical archives looking for anything related to Crossing 23, the eastbound line, midnight trains. What I found made me understand why no one wanted to talk about this. In 1957, there had been an accident at what was then called the Fairmont Crossing. A passenger train, the Midnight Express, had been making its regular late-night run from Central Station to the eastern suburbs. At 11:54 p.m., while approaching the crossing, the engineer had reported mechanical failure. The brakes weren't responding. He'd radioed ahead, warning the crossing controller to activate the gates to stop traffic because he was coming through fast and couldn't stop. The crossing controller, a man named Harold Vickers, had activated the gates. But there had been a malfunction. The gates on the western side of the tracks had descended, but the eastern gates had failed to lower. A truck carrying industrial chemicals had been approaching from the east, driver unaware of the danger. The Midnight Express had hit the truck at 47 miles per hour. The collision had derailed the locomotive and the first 3 cars. The chemical tank on the truck had ruptured and the resulting fire had been catastrophic. 43 passengers dead, plus the truck driver and the train crew. The investigation had blamed Harold Vickers. His maintenance log showed he'd noted intermittent problems with the eastern gates weeks earlier but had failed to take them out of service. He'd been charged with negligent manslaughter. The case had been in the news for months. Vickers had committed suicide before the trial, hanging himself in his apartment. His suicide note was a single sentence. I told them the crossing was wrong. After the accident, the Fairmont crossing had been completely rebuilt. New tracks, new signals, new everything. The section of rail that the Midnight Express had been traveling on, coming from the north, from what was then the Central Station approach, had been decommissioned when the system was modernized in the 1970s. That tunnel had been sealed, abandoned, replaced by a new route. That northern approach didn't exist anymore. According to current maps, it was just empty space, filled in, built over. But every night at midnight, the sensors at Crossing 23 detected a train approaching from that sealed northern tunnel. A train that had been destroyed 68 years ago. I needed to see the tunnel, the sealed northern approach. I needed to know if there was something physical causing this, some explanation that didn't require me to believe in ghosts. I took a personal day and went to the city planning office requesting access to the old railway maps. The clerk looked at me skeptically but pulled up the archived diagrams. The old Central Station northern approach, I said. I need to know where it is now, what's on top of it. She traced the route on the map. Looks like it runs under, let's see. Part of it is under the Meridian Building parking structure. This section is under Fairmont Avenue itself, and the northern end is under Harrison Park. Can you access it? Access what? It's sealed, filled with concrete back in the 70s when they decommissioned it. All of it? She zoomed in on the map, checking notes. According to this, the southern end was filled, but the northern section, actually it looks like it was just sealed. They put concrete barriers at the entrances, but the tunnel itself is still intact. Too expensive to fill the whole thing, I guess. So the tunnel still exists. On paper, sure, but you can't get to it. The entrance barriers are permanent. I thanked her and left. I knew where I needed to go. Harrison Park is a small green space on the north side of the city. 3 acres of grass and trees, a playground, some walking paths. In the northeast corner, there's an old maintenance building, abandoned, covered in graffiti. Behind it, mostly hidden by overgrown bushes, is a concrete wall with a heavy steel door. I'd brought tools, bolt cutters for the chain, a pry bar for the door. It took me 20 minutes of work, but I got it open. The tunnel mouth was exactly as I'd expected. Concrete barriers had been installed just past the door, but they'd deteriorated over the decades. There were gaps, spaces where determined explorers had broken through. I squeezed past the barriers and into the tunnel. It was vast and empty. The rails were still there, rusted, covered in decades of dust and debris. The tunnel stretched ahead into darkness, curving gradually south toward where crossing 23 would be. I walked for what felt like a mile, my flashlight beam inadequate against the darkness. The air was cold and still, with that particular smell of old concrete and stagnant water. My footsteps echoed strangely, returning to me from odd angles. Eventually I found it, the point where the tunnel had been truly sealed, where the modern system had walled off the past. A massive concrete barrier filled the tunnel from floor to ceiling, rail to rail. Beyond it would be the active eastbound line, the current tracks crossing 23. But there was something wrong with the barrier. In the beam of my flashlight, I could see marks on it. Not graffiti, something else. Scratches, gouges, like something had been trying to break through from the other side. And at the base of the barrier, where it met the old rails, there was a gap. Not large, maybe 6 inches high, a foot wide, but definitely there. A hole in the seal, opening onto darkness beyond. I knelt down and shined my light through the gap. I could see the modern tunnel on the other side, the new rails, the updated lighting. And as I watched, the lights began to flicker. Once, twice, then steady. I checked my watch. 11:58 p.m., 2 minutes to midnight. I should have left then. I should have run back through the tunnel, back through the park, back to somewhere safe and sane, but I stayed. Because I needed to see. I needed to know if this was real. At 11:59 p.m. I felt the vibration, a tremor in the old rails beneath me, a hum that built gradually from silence into something I could hear and feel. At midnight exactly, the train came. It emerged from the darkness behind me, from the depths of the sealed northern tunnel. I saw the headlight first, a pale yellow glow that didn't quite illuminate anything. Then the locomotive itself, an old steam engine from the 1950s but rendered in shades of gray. Translucent, not quite there. The Midnight Express. It passed by me slowly, close enough to touch if I dared to reach out. I could see through it, see the tunnel wall beyond, see my own shadow on the concrete. But I could also see details. The number 847 painted on the locomotive, the faces of passengers in the windows, all of them turning to look at me as they passed. They saw me. Their eyes locked onto mine, and in their faces I saw terror and confusion and a desperate pleading. "Help us," their expressions said. "We don't understand. We're supposed to be somewhere else." The train moved forward, approaching the concrete barrier. I thought it would stop, would fade away, would do whatever ghost trains do when confronted with solid matter. But it didn't stop. It pushed through the barrier, through the gap at the bottom, compressing and distorting as it passed through the opening. Like water forced through a pipe, the train squeezed through the impossible space, emerging on the other side in the modern tunnel. I watched it accelerate, heading south toward crossing 23, toward the site of its own destruction. I ran. I scrambled back through the old tunnel, burst out into Harrison Park, got in my car and drove. I didn't stop until I was at Control Station 7, breathless, terrified, needing to see my monitors, needing to confirm what I'd just witnessed. I pulled up the Crossing 23 camera feed. The crossing was clear, the gates up, the signals green. But on the sensor logs I could see the entry. Train detected. North approach, midnight crossing complete. And in the slow-motion replay of the camera footage I could see it passing through. The Midnight Express, still transparent, still impossible, carrying its ghostly passengers toward a destination they would never reach. I submitted my resignation the next morning. I didn't explain. didn't provide details. I just wrote personal reasons on the form and walked out. The MTA replaced the sensors at crossing 23 one more time. They installed video monitoring. They assigned an investigator to review the midnight events. But the gates still come down every night at midnight, and something still passes through, detected by every sensor, visible to anyone who watches long enough. They've stopped trying to explain it. The official position is now, known anomaly, investigation ongoing. The maintenance crews refuse to work at crossing 23 after dark. The local residents have gotten used to it. Some of them even gather at the crossing at midnight filming, waiting to see the ghost train. I've heard they're considering closing the crossing permanently, rerouting traffic, but I know that won't stop it. The Midnight Express isn't tied to the physical crossing, it's tied to time itself, to that moment in 1957 when everything went wrong. It's doomed to replay its final journey, emerging from a tunnel that no longer exists, passing through a crossing that was rebuilt decades ago, heading toward a collision that already happened. And the passengers on that train, the ones I saw looking at me with such desperate confusion, they don't know they're dead. They don't know they're ghosts. They just know they're going somewhere, that they bought tickets and boarded a train and it should have taken them home. But some journeys never end. Some trains keep running long after their routes have been abandoned, their stations demolished, their destinations forgotten. They run on phantom rails through the space between what was and what is, carrying passengers who will never arrive. The tunnels remember every train that ever ran through them, every accident, every near miss, every tragedy. And sometimes when the conditions are exactly right, when the clock strikes the perfect hour, those memories become solid enough to trigger sensors and lower gates and make people believe just for a moment that the past can return. I don't work for the MTA anymore, but I still think about crossing 23, about the Midnight Express, about those passengers trapped in an eternal loop. I wonder if they can see us, the living people standing at the crossing with our phones and cameras. I wonder if they understand what they've become. And sometimes late at night I think about Harold Vickers, the crossing controller who tried to warn people that something was wrong, who took the blame for a tragedy he couldn't prevent, who hanged himself rather than face trial. I think his note was true. The crossing was wrong. Not just the equipment, not just the gates. Something deeper was wrong. Some fundamental error in the fabric of that place. And when the Midnight Express hit that truck, when those 43 people died, when Vickers took his own life, all of that pain and terror and guilt soaked into the ground, into the rails, into the system itself. Now it plays back every night at midnight, a recording that can never be erased. The trains remember, the tunnels remember, and the dead keep riding, forever searching for the end of their journey, never understanding that they reached it 68 years ago. Some crossings are marked with tragedies you can never fully clear, and some signals will keep flashing long after there's any hope of stopping what's coming. Story 5. The shifting tracks. I stepped over the rail to measure the gauge width, and when I put my foot down, the rail wasn't where it had been a second ago. It had moved, shifted 3 inches to the left, just enough that I stumbled and nearly fell. I stood there, staring at the track, my measuring tape dangling uselessly from my hand. Rails don't move. They're bolted to ties, spiked into ballast, secured by tons of steel and concrete. But I'd watched this one slide, smooth as silk, repositioning itself while I was mid-step. And when I looked down the tunnel, I saw others moving too. The whole track bed writhing slowly like something alive. Rails crossing and recrossing, creating patterns that shouldn't be possible. Shouldn't exist. The tunnel was rewriting itself, and I was standing in the middle of the manuscript. My name is Michael Cortez, and I've been a track inspector for the Metropolitan Transit Authority for 9 years. Track inspection is physical work, methodical and exacting. You walk every foot of rail, checking for cracks, measuring wear, testing bolts, examining ties. You document everything because the integrity of the track is the integrity of the entire system. If the track fails, people die. It's that simple. I've always taken pride in my thoroughness. I catch problems early before they become emergencies. My maintenance recommendations are precise, my reports detailed. In 9 years, I've never missed a critical defect, never overlooked a safety issue, but on December 1st, I walked into Section 9D for a routine quarterly inspection, and I found something that shouldn't exist. Something that made me question not just my eyes, but my understanding of how the physical world operates. Section 9D is a minor spur tunnel that branches off the southbound main line, running about 2,000 feet before terminating at an old maintenance depot. The depot hasn't been active in years, but we still inspect the track quarterly because it's occasionally used for equipment storage. The tunnel is straight, well-lit, unremarkable in every way. At least, it had been unremarkable every other time I'd inspected it. I entered the tunnel at 9:15 a.m., carrying my standard equipment, measuring gauges, rail profile gauge, ultrasonic flaw detector, spike maul for testing tie plate tightness, and my ever-present clipboard. The first 100 yards checked out normally. Rail gauge within tolerance, bolt tension good, ballast properly distributed, drainage clear. At marker 0.2, I knelt to check a rail joint. Standard procedure. Visual inspection for cracks, measure the gap between rail ends, check bolt tightness. Everything looked fine. I made my notation and stood up to continue. That's when I noticed the tie. 20 feet ahead on the left rail, there was a railroad tie that was perpendicular to all the others. Instead of running across the track bed supporting both rails, it ran parallel to the left rail, jutting out into the tunnel like a misplaced splinter. I walked toward it, frowning. This made no sense. Ties are installed during track construction, and they stay in position unless someone deliberately removes and replaces them. They don't rotate, don't shift, don't spontaneously change orientation. And yet here was one, clearly wrong, clearly impossible. I knelt down to examine it. The tie was standard creosote-treated wood, weathered but solid. But the spike holes, the points where the tie would normally be spiked to the rail, were empty on one side and missing entirely on the other. This tie wasn't secured to anything, it was just there, wedged into the ballast in the wrong orientation. I pulled out my camera and photographed it, then made detailed notes. This would need to be corrected immediately. A loose tie was a derailment hazard. I stood up and continued my inspection. At marker 0.3, I found another anomaly. The right rail curved slightly, maybe 10 degrees, while the left rail continued straight. The two rails diverged for about 6 feet before converging again. This was impossible. Rails are manufactured and installed in matched pairs. They curve together or they don't curve at all. You can't have one rail curve while the other stays straight without creating an impossible gauge width. But I measured it anyway, and the gauge was correct. Exactly 4 feet, 8.5 inches, the standard gauge that every train in the system runs on. I measured it 3 times, certain I was making an error. But the measurements were consistent. Somehow the rails maintained correct gauge even though they followed different paths. I documented it and moved on, deeply unsettled now. At marker 0.4, the tunnel lights began to flicker. Not in unison, each fixture flickered independently, creating a strobing effect that made the tunnel seem to pulse. I radioed maintenance to report the lighting issue, but got only static in response. I checked my radio. It showed full bars, no issues, but every channel was pure white noise. My phone showed no signal, even though I'd had full coverage at the tunnel entrance. The battery indicator was dropping rapidly, from 83% to 71% as I watched. I should have turned back then. Every instinct was screaming at me that something was fundamentally wrong with this tunnel. But I'm a professional. I'd been assigned to inspect Section 9D, and I was going to complete the inspection. At marker 0.5, halfway through the tunnel, I found the switch. A railway switch, also called a turnout, is a mechanical device that allows trains to move from one track to another. They're complex installations requiring careful engineering and precise maintenance. They don't appear spontaneously in the middle of straight tunnels. But here was one, installed in the center of Section 9D where no switch had ever existed. I checked my clipboard, pulling out the track diagram for 9D. The diagram showed a straight single-track tunnel with no switches, no junctions, no complications. I looked back up at the switch. It was real, solid, definitely there, and it was old. The mechanism was rusted, the point rails worn from decades of use. This switch had been here for a long time, which meant either my diagram was wrong or reality was. I approached the switch carefully. The points were set for the diverging route, directing traffic away from the main path, but there was no diverging route. The switch pointed toward the tunnel wall. Except as I got closer, I realized the wall wasn't solid. There was an opening there, a narrow passage branching off at a shallow angle, a passage that absolutely should not exist. I pulled out my flashlight and shined it into the opening. Rails extended into it, disappearing into darkness after 30 feet. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough for a single piece of equipment, and the walls were rough, unfinished concrete, unlike the smooth tile work of the main tunnel. I made a decision. I needed to see where this went. I stepped onto the switch points and walked into the side passage. My flashlight beam was inadequate, swallowed by the darkness ahead. The passage curved gently to the right, descending slightly. After about 100 feet, it opened into a larger space. It was another tunnel, similar in size to Section 9D, but oriented at 90 degrees to it. Rails ran in both directions, disappearing into darkness. But the rails were wrong. They didn't run parallel to each other. They wove over and under each other, braiding like rope, creating an impossible track configuration. I stood at the edge of this space, trying to process what I was seeing. Rails can't weave. They're rigid steel bars that follow specific paths. The idea of them braiding was physically nonsensical, but as I watched, one of the rails moved. It was subtle, just a few inches, the rail sliding sideways through the ballast like a snake adjusting its coils. Then another rail moved, shifting position, the two of them trading places in a smooth, coordinated motion. The tracks were alive, or if not alive, then active in some way that transcended mechanical function. They were rearranging themselves, creating new patterns, new configurations. I backed away slowly, returning to the side passage. Behind me, I could hear the sound of metal sliding on stone, the rails continuing their endless reorganization. I emerged back in Section 9D and immediately noticed something that froze me in place. The switch was gone. The tracks ran straight through where it had been, no evidence of the mechanical installation I'd seen 5 minutes ago. I turned around, looking back at the passage I'd just exited. It was sealed. Solid concrete wall, no opening, no gap. The wall looked exactly like every other section of tunnel wall, tiled, finished, decades old. I reached out and touched it. Solid, real, impassable. But I'd just walked through there. I'd seen the other tunnel, watched the rails move. I had photographs. I pulled out my camera and checked the images. The last photo showed the incorrectly oriented tie at marker 0.2. Everything after that was blank, corrupted files that wouldn't open. I continued the inspection in a daze, documenting everything mechanically while my mind raced. At marker 0.6, I found symbols carved into the rail. Not graffiti, these were precise, deliberate markings cut directly into the steel. They looked like ancient writing, or mathematical notation or circuit diagrams. I couldn't tell which. At marker 0.7, the left rail was missing. Just gone, ballast and ties present, but the rail itself absent. Yet according to my gauge, the track width was still correct. I was measuring the distance between the right rail and empty air and getting the standard 4 feet, 8.5 inches. At marker 0.8, I found the shrine. It was built into a service alcove. A small space that was supposed to contain emergency equipment. Instead, it held a carefully arranged collection of objects. Old railroad spikes arranged in geometric patterns, fragments of rail arranged like offerings, lanterns that burned with flames that produced no heat, and at the center, a photograph. The photograph showed a group of workers, maybe 15 men, standing on a completed section of track. They wore the work clothes of the 1920s or 1930s. The photo was labeled in faded ink. Section 9D crew, March 1932, tunnel completion. I looked closer at the faces. Most were blurred by age and poor photo quality, but one was clear. A man in the center, younger than the others, staring directly at the camera with an intense, unsettling expression. He looked exactly like me. Not similar, identical. Same face, same eyes, same scar on his left cheek that I'd gotten from a childhood bicycle accident. I stumbled backward out of the alcove, my heart hammering. This was wrong. All of it was wrong. The tunnel was playing games with me, showing me impossible things, trying to tell me something I didn't want to understand. I ran. I abandoned the inspection and ran back toward the entrance, my equipment bag slapping against my hip, my breath coming in gasps. The tunnel stretched ahead of me, longer than it should have been, markers counting down slower than they should, 0.7, 0.6, 0.5. At marker 0.4, I looked back and saw the tunnel behind me had changed. The tracks were moving now, openly, writhing like living things. Rails lifted and twisted, creating knots and loops, forming shapes that hurt to look at. At marker 0.3, I heard voices, men talking, laughing, the sound of work being done. Ghost sounds from 1932 from the crew that built this tunnel, still echoing through time. At marker 0.2, I found a man standing on the tracks. He wore work clothes from the 1930s and held a surveyor's level. He turned to look at me as I approached, and I saw his face clearly. It was me, or a version of me, the same face from the photograph. "You're late," he said. "We've been waiting." I didn't stop, didn't respond. I ran past him or through him, I couldn't tell which. He dissolved into shadow as I passed. At marker 0.1, the tunnel entrance was finally visible. I burst out into the main line tunnel, gasping, and immediately collapsed against the wall. Behind me, section 9D looked normal. Well lit, straight, ordinary. I could see down its length to the maintenance depot at the far end. Nothing moved. Nothing seemed wrong. My radio crackled to life. "Cortez, this is Central. We lost your signal for a while there. Everything okay?" I stared at the radio. How long was I out of contact? Maybe 90 seconds. You're in a dead zone at the 9D junction sometimes. Did you complete the inspection? 90 seconds. I'd been in that tunnel for over an hour. Or I thought I had. Time itself was wrong in there, compressed or expanded or simply ignored. "No," I said. "No, I didn't complete it. There are issues. Safety issues. Section 9D needs to be closed immediately pending full structural analysis." There was a pause. What kind of issues? How could I explain? Rails that move on their own. Tunnels that reconfigure themselves. Shrines to crews long dead. Versions of myself standing in the darkness. "Track integrity problems," I said finally. "Severe. It's not safe." They closed section 9D that afternoon. A full engineering team was dispatched to assess it. They spent 3 days conducting a comprehensive structural analysis, using ground-penetrating radar, laser measurement systems, and physical inspection. Their report concluded that Section 9D was in excellent condition. Track gauge perfect, rail condition good, no structural anomalies detected. They recommended it be returned to service immediately. But they didn't see what I saw. They didn't find the switch, the side passage, the braided rails, the shrine. Or maybe they did see those things and chose not to report them, chose to pretend that reality was stable and consistent and safe. I requested a transfer. They granted it without question. There's always a shortage of experienced inspectors willing to work the deeper tunnels. I'm assigned to surface routes now. Open-air tracks where sunlight reaches, where the rails are visible for miles, where nothing moves unless something pushes it. But I still think about Section 9D. I think about that photograph, about the man with my face standing in 1932. I think about the braided rails and the moving tracks and the shrine built to something that predates our understanding of what the underground is. And sometimes, late at night, I pull up the historical records and I search. I look for any mention of a Michael Cortez who worked for the railway in the 1930s. I look for accident reports, crew manifests, employment records. I haven't found anything yet, but I know I will eventually. Because Section 9D is trying to tell me something. It's showing me a pattern, a connection across time, a truth about the tunnels that most people never discover. The tracks remember everyone who walks them. They record our passage, absorb our presence, weave us into their endless configurations. And in places like Section 9D, where the barriers between past and present grow thin, those records become visible. The dead and the living walk the same rails, separated by decades but occupying the same space. I think I'm supposed to go back there. I think the tunnel is waiting for me to complete something that started in 1932. Something that version of myself began but never finished. The rails have been shifting, preparing, creating the exact pattern needed for whatever comes next. But I'm not ready yet. I'm not ready to walk into that darkness and discover what the moving tracks are trying to spell, what message they've been writing in steel and stone for 90 years. The underground keeps its secrets, but it also makes demands. Some inspections never end. They just pause, waiting for the right moment, the right conditions, the right person to finally see the pattern complete. And when that moment comes, when I finally return to Section 9D and walk its length one last time, I think I'll understand. I'll see the completed pattern, read the message written in shifting rails, and learn what the tunnel has been trying to tell me all along. Until then, I walk the surface routes and I measure the stable rails and I pretend that tracks only go where we build them. But I know the truth. The rails go everywhere into the past and the future, connecting moments we thought were separate, joining lives we thought were distinct. The tracks remember, and sooner or later, they make us remember too. Story 6, The Final Inspection. The symbols etched into the rails were glowing now, pulsing with a faint phosphorescent light that had no visible source. I'd walked past these same rails 1,000 times over 26 years, and they'd always been blank steel, worn smooth by decades of train wheels. But today, on my final inspection before retirement, they were speaking. The symbols formed words in a language I shouldn't understand, but somehow did. And they were telling me the truth about this tunnel, about every tunnel in the system. They were telling me why some inspectors never retire, why some of us disappear on our final shifts, why the underground always needs someone to walk its depths. The message was clear. The inspection never ends. The tunnel doesn't let you leave. I'd been walking toward this moment for 26 years, and I was finally here, at the point where past and future collapse into one eternal present, where the rails claim what they've always owned. My name is Robert Ashford, and today is December 20th, my last day with the Metropolitan Transit Authority after 26 years of service. Tomorrow I'll be a retired man, free to do whatever retirees do, travel, garden, read all those books I've been putting off. But today I have one final assignment, a solo inspection of Section 4F, the old Eastern Tunnel that predates most of the current system. Section 4F is ancient by transit system standards. Original construction dates to 1923, making it over 100 years old. It's been upgraded and maintained over the decades, but the basic structure remains unchanged. A 2-mile stretch of tunnel connecting what used to be the industrial district to the old waterfront, now mostly abandoned since the city's shipping operations moved south. The tunnel sees minimal traffic these days, one maintenance train per day, and occasional equipment transfers. It's scheduled for decommissioning next year to be sealed permanently as part of the system modernization project. But until then, it requires quarterly inspections, and my supervisor thought it would be fitting for my final inspection to be a quiet walk through a piece of history. Poetic ending to a distinguished career, he'd said, handing me the assignment sheet. Nice, easy day, Ashford. Take your time, enjoy it. Consider it a farewell tour. I'd smiled and accepted the assignment, grateful for the consideration. Section 4F was indeed a good final walk. Straight, simple, no complications. A fitting end to 26 years of more challenging inspections. But as I stood at the entrance to Section 4F at 7:30 a.m., equipment bag in hand, I felt a strange reluctance, a weight in my chest, a coldness that had nothing to do with the December morning. I'd inspected this tunnel before. It was on my regular rotation. But today it felt different. The tunnel mouth looked darker, deeper, as if it extended much farther than the 2 miles I knew it contained. I shook off the feeling and entered, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom ahead. The tunnel was as I remembered it. Old tile work on the walls, newer LED lighting installed during the last upgrade, rails showing their age but structurally sound. The air was cold and carried that distinctive smell of deep underground, concrete, mineral, time. My inspection routine was automatic after 26 years. I moved from checkpoint to checkpoint, measuring, documenting, testing. Rail gauge, bolt tension, tie condition, drainage function. Everything was familiar, comfortable, exactly as it should be, except for the sound. At marker 0.3, I stopped and listened. There was a low hum coming from somewhere ahead, a vibration I could feel more than hear. It was constant, unchanging, like the sound of machinery running deep in the tunnel's structure. But there was no machinery in Section 4F, nothing that would create that kind of resonance. I continued forward and the hum grew gradually louder. At marker 0.5, I could distinguish individual frequencies within it, harmonic overtones that suggested something complex, something designed. It sounded almost musical, if music could be mechanical and ancient and purposeful all at once. At marker 0.6, I found the first symbol. It was carved into the left rail, cut directly into the steel with precision that suggested industrial tools. The symbol was geometric, a series of interlocking circles and lines that created a pattern I didn't recognize. It was about 3 inches across, and it had been there long enough that the edges of the cut were smooth, worn by decades of train wheels passing over it. I knelt down to photograph it. As I focused my camera, I noticed that the symbol seemed to be catching the light strangely, reflecting it in ways that flat steel shouldn't. I touched it with my gloved hand. The symbol was warm, not hot, but noticeably warmer than the surrounding rail, as if heat was flowing through it from some source. I stood up and continued my inspection, more alert now, looking for additional symbols. I found them every 50 feet or so, alternating between the left and right rails. Each was different, each carved with the same precision, each slightly warm to the touch. At marker 0.8, the symbols began to change. They were no longer just geometric patterns, they had started to resemble writing. Not any alphabet I recognized, but definitely characters meant to convey information. They were organized in lines reading left to right or perhaps right to left, I couldn't tell which. I documented each one, photographing them methodically, trying to maintain my professional detachment. But my hands were shaking slightly. After 26 years of inspecting these tunnels, I was seeing something I'd never encountered before. Something that shouldn't exist. At marker 1.0, the halfway point, I reached the old crossover junction. This was a location where decades ago trains could switch between parallel tracks. The crossover had been disabled in the 1980s, the switch mechanisms removed, but the junction point remained visible, a place where four rails met in a complex intersection. The junction was glowing. Not brightly, it was subtle, like phosphorescence, a pale blue-green light that seemed to emanate from the steel itself. And the symbols here weren't just carved. They covered every surface of the junction, rail and tie and ballast, a complete text written in that unknown language, all of it glowing with the same cold light. I stood at the edge of the junction, my flashlight beam inadequate against the strange luminescence. The hum was louder here, resonating through the tunnel structure, making the air vibrate. And beneath the hum, I could hear something else. Voices speaking in rhythm, chanting words I couldn't distinguish. My radio was dead. I'd noticed it earlier but hadn't thought much of it. Section 4F had always had poor radio reception. But now I realized my phone was off too, powered down despite having a full charge when I entered the tunnel. My flashlight flickered once, twice, but continued working, though the beam seemed weaker than it should be. I had a choice. Turn back, report this, let someone else investigate. Or continue forward, complete my final inspection, discover what the tunnel was trying to show me. I walked across the glowing junction. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming. As I stepped onto the luminescent rails, I felt a surge of something, information, memory, connection, flowing through my body. It wasn't painful, but it was intense, like touching a live wire that conducted thought instead of electricity. And suddenly I understood the symbols. They weren't in an unknown language. They were in a language beneath language, a form of communication that predated words. They spoke directly to some primal part of my brain, bypassing conscious thought. They were telling me the history of the tunnel. Section 4F had been built in 1923, but the tunnel itself was older. Much older. The construction crew in 1923 had discovered an existing tunnel, ancient beyond measure, and they'd simply incorporated it into their railway project. They'd laid new rails over ancient ones, installed modern lighting alongside marks that glowed without electricity, built a transit system on top of something that had been there long before humans dreamed of underground transportation. The original builders were never named in the visions flowing through my mind. But I saw them working, saw them carving the symbols, saw them completing a project that had taken generations. They had built this tunnel for a purpose I couldn't quite grasp, something related to the movement of, not people, not cargo, but something else. Energy, perhaps, or time itself, or concepts I had no words for. And they had built in safeguards, protocols, requirements. The tunnel needed maintenance, needed inspection, needed someone to walk its length regularly and verify its integrity. Not the physical structure, that was secondary. They needed someone to maintain the connection, to keep the flow active, to ensure the tunnel remained what it was meant to be. That's what we'd been doing for 100 years, all of us inspectors walking these rails. We thought we were checking for cracks and wear, but we were actually maintaining something far older, far more important. We were the priests of a temple we didn't know existed, performing rituals we thought were engineering. I stepped off the junction, gasping. The connection broke, and I was just Robert Ashford again, a track inspector with a clipboard and a headache. but the knowledge remained. I understood now what Section 4F was, what all the old tunnels were. The city had built its transit system on top of something ancient, and that ancient thing was still active, still functional, still needed tending. I continued my inspection in a daze. At marker 1.2, I found a service alcove I'd never noticed before, though I'd walked past this spot dozens of times. Inside the alcove was a book, handwritten, bound in leather that should have rotted decades ago but remained pristine. I opened it. The pages were filled with names, dates, notes. It was a log of all the inspectors who'd walked Section 4F going back to 1923. Hundreds of names, each with a start date and an end date. I flipped to the most recent entries. I found my own name, Robert Ashford. Start March 15, 1999. The end date was blank. Above my name was Harold Perkins, my predecessor. His entry showed, Harold Perkins, start April 3, 1981, end March 14, 1999. March 14, 1999 was the day before I'd started working for the MTA. It was also the day Harold Perkins had disappeared. He'd gone out for a routine inspection and never returned. They'd searched for weeks, found no trace, eventually declared him dead in absentia. I'd been hired to fill his position. I flipped backward through the log. Every inspector listed had ended their service on the day before the next inspector started. Every single one. Some entries noted retired, some noted transferred, some noted lost. But the pattern was consistent. No gaps, no overlaps. Section 4F always had exactly one assigned inspector, and when that inspector ended, another immediately began. At the very back of the book, I found a note written in English, dated 1923. To whoever reads this, you have been chosen to maintain the old way beneath the new world. This is an honor and a burden. When your time ends, another will come. Do not resist the transition. Do not attempt to warn others. The tunnel provides and the tunnel claims. Walk your section faithfully and you will understand. Thomas Whitmore, First Inspector. I closed the book and left the alcove. My hands were steady now. I understood what today was, what my final inspection really meant. At marker 1.5, I found the others. They were standing beside the tracks, translucent, not quite present. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all wearing work clothes from different eras. I recognized Harold Perkins immediately. I'd seen his photo in the MTA newsletter when they'd memorialized him. He nodded to me, his expression sad but accepting. I tried to retire too, he said, his voice echoing strangely. Thought I'd get out, live on my pension, see my grandchildren grow up. But the tunnel doesn't work that way. We walk until we understand, and then we become part of what we've been maintaining. I don't want this, I said. None of us did. But you've been walking these rails for 26 years, Ashford. You've been feeding the tunnel your presence, your energy, your time. It knows you now. You're part of it. I looked at the others. They stood silent, watching, waiting. Some looked peaceful. Some looked anguished, but all looked resigned. What happens if I turn back? If I don't complete the inspection? Harold smiled sadly. You can try, some have. But the tunnel is 2 miles long when you enter, and infinite when you try to leave. You'll walk until you accept it. Days, weeks, months. The tunnel has patience. I continued forward. What else could I do? At marker 1.8, the symbols on the rails were glowing brightly now, pulsing in rhythm with the hum. I could read them all, understand their complete meaning. They were instructions, protocols, a manual for maintaining the ancient machinery that existed beneath and within the railway infrastructure. At marker 1.9, I found my replacement waiting. He was young, maybe late 20s, wearing a MTA uniform, holding a clipboard. He looked solid, real, alive. Mr. Ashford, he said, I'm David Chen. I'm starting tomorrow. They said I might find you here. Asked if I could walk the last section with you, learn the route. I stared at him. Tomorrow, December 21st. His start date would be December 21st and my end date would be December 20th. The pattern continued. Did they tell you anything about Section 4F? I asked. Just that it's an old tunnel, scheduled for decommissioning. Easy inspection route, good place to learn the basics. He smiled, eager, enthusiastic. He had no idea. I wanted to warn him, wanted to tell him to run, to refuse the assignment, to find any other job in any other place. But Harold's words echoed in my mind. Do not attempt to warn others. It's a good route, I heard myself saying. Straightforward, you'll do fine. We walked the final section together, me pointing out the checkpoints, explaining the procedures, introducing him to the tunnel that would consume the next decades of his life. He took notes diligently, asked good questions, seemed genuinely interested in the work. At marker 2.0, the end of Section 4F, we emerged into the old waterfront depot. The space was vast and empty, lit by dusty skylights filled with abandoned equipment. This was where the tunnel terminated, where inspectors would normally turn around and walk back. But I noticed something I'd never seen before. A door in the far wall, small and easy to miss, marked only with a symbol I now recognized from the rails. The exit, not for the living, but for those who'd completed their service. I think I'll rest here for a moment, I told David. You go ahead, file the initial report. I'll catch up. He nodded and left, climbing the stairs to the surface, to his life, to the 26 or 30 or 40 years he'd spent walking this tunnel before his own replacement arrived. I walked to the door. It opened easily, silently, revealing a corridor that extended into darkness. But it wasn't frightening darkness. It was the darkness of completion, of rest, of finally understanding. I looked back one last time at Section 4F, at the tunnel I'd walked for 26 years. The rails gleamed in the dim light, the symbols glowing faintly, the ancient machinery humming beneath the modern surface. I'd spent my career maintaining something I didn't understand, performing rituals disguised as engineering. But now I understood. The tunnels were alive in a way, conscious in a way, purposeful in a way that transcended human intention. We hadn't built on them. We'd been invited to build with them, to incorporate our needs into their ancient function, to become part of their eternal operation. And now I was being invited to go deeper, to understand more, to become not just a maintainer, but part of the maintained structure itself. I stepped through the door. It closed behind me with a soft click. Behind me in the depot, I heard footsteps echoing. David coming back to check on me. He'd find the space empty, report it, and they'd search briefly before concluding I'd retired quietly, went home, moved away. In a week, they'd mail my pension to an address I'd never reach. In a month, they'd forget about me entirely. But I'd be here in the deeper sections, walking inspections on levels that newer employees would never see. Maintaining the infrastructure beneath the infrastructure, ensuring that the ancient machinery kept running, that the tunnels kept providing their mysterious service to a world that had forgotten they existed. The corridor ahead glowed with the same phosphorescent light as the junction. I could see others walking it, the inspectors who'd come before me, all of us proceeding deeper into the structure, toward whatever waited at the true center of this vast underground network. My final inspection would never end, but I understood now that I'd never wanted it to. For 26 years, I'd been happiest in the tunnels, walking the rails, checking the infrastructure, maintaining the connection. I'd told myself I was looking forward to retirement, but the truth was simpler. I belonged here. The tunnels had known it before I did. They'd been preparing me, training me, slowly transforming me into something that could exist comfortably in the deep places, the old places, the places where human and ancient machinery merged into something else entirely. I walked forward into the glowing corridor, and with each step I felt lighter, more complete, more myself than I'd ever been on the surface. This was my retirement, not an ending, but a transformation. Not a departure from my life's work, but a graduation into its deepest form. Behind me, far above, David Chen would begin his first official shift tomorrow. He'd walk Section 4F, check the rails, document the symbols he couldn't yet read, feel the hum he couldn't yet understand. And day by day, year by year, the tunnel would teach him, would change him, would prepare him for his own final inspection. The cycle continues. The tunnels always need inspectors, and some of us are born to walk the deep places, to maintain the ancient ways, to become part of the endless underground. My final inspection is complete. My eternal inspection has just begun. And in the darkness ahead, I hear the rails humming their approval, welcoming me home.